Hi there. So I'd like to talk about speaking part one, the kinds of questions that you'll get and how you should approach speaking part one. When you walk into the room, the examiner will greet you and you can greet the examiner, and then you'll have a seat in front of the examiner. Um, you'll show them your ID, and during this part where they're just asking you a few questions about your ID and things, it's not considered part of the test in that you're not being assessed on your language. They'll start the recording, and then the actual assessment part starts when they say, now in this first part, I'd like to ask you some questions about yourself. So that means the test is underway and all of the questions you'll be asked from this point will be assessed. Now, the first set of questions that you'll get is always the same in that you'll be asked either about your job or your studies, depending on if you're a student or a worker. So they'll say, do you work or are you a student? And if you say I work, they will say, ask you questions about work. If you say I'm a student, they'll ask you questions about being a student. Now, if you're not sure, like sometimes people will say, well, I don't have a job now, and I'm not in school, so they might say, okay, they'll change the questions to ask you about when you had a job. So do you like your job will become did you like your job? So don't worry if you're not sure what to say, just ask. But it really doesn't matter. You can continue as you feel comfortable. Um, so during this first part, they'll either ask you about that or where you're from. That could be the city where you're from, the city where you grew up. It could be about your apartment or your home, things like this. So it'll be one of those two topics to begin with, and you'll be asked about three questions. It's a good idea to think about your job and think about vocabulary you can use, think about where you're from, the place you live, but I wouldn't prepare answers. So being able to answer questions about these topics is good, but sometimes people memorize answers about their jobs, and it sounds very obvious that the answer is memorized. Now, there's no penalty per se for memorizing your answer, but when people are speaking from memory, their intonation is very flat, they repeat themselves, they correct themselves a lot, and it just sounds bad. You're much better off just being aware of what you're going to be asked about approximately and then answering. You could also get questions which you might not be expecting, but which are still easy to answer. So a while ago, there was a question, what do you do when you first arrive home from work? Or what do you do when you first arrive home from school? So that's not really about work or school, but it's connected to the topic. So again, most people haven't thought about that, but it's a very easy question to answer. When you finish this part of the test, you'll be asked about two more topics. So you're generally asked about three topics in total for part one of the test. So work or school or where you're from, and then two other topics, which could be about anything. You can see the questions at the top of the page below the video on the website, and you'll see that those are very, very different topics. You could be asked about those. You could be asked about, work. You could be asked about friendship, free time, technology, education, anything really. So the best thing to do is not worry too much about the questions you're going to be asked because they're all reasonably easy questions to answer. They just require you to use your own ideas, your own experience, talk about your own preferences, things like that. So they're about you and they're basically simple questions to answer. One thing you want to listen for is the kind of transition changes between the questions. So if they ask you about your job and then they're going to ask you about technology, they won't just start asking you the questions. They'll introduce it by saying, now I'd like to talk about technology, or let's talk about technology. So be listening for that transition signal to know that, okay, now I'm going to have a few questions on a different topic. So you generally get 4 questions for each of the subsequent 2 topics. And again, they're the same in the sense that they're questions about you and you just answer them naturally and simply. So in total, you'll get around 10 questions. And the examiner is supposed to make the first part between 4 and 5 minutes. So most people, that's pretty easy. Occasionally someone, if they don't speak much or they're quite fluent and they don't give super long answers, but they give adequate answers, sometimes it'll end a bit before 4 minutes, which is fine. But if you get to the point where it's at 5 minutes, they will stop you and stop the test. stop that part of the test. So you may not get that many questions, but generally what happens is that people get all of the questions in part one, and that's the goal. So it gives you an opportunity to talk about lots of different things and to show language in different areas. Now, there's something important. If you don't understand the question, you just need to ask the examiner to repeat the question. So they can repeat the question once. So you can just say, what? Or I don't understand, or can you repeat the question? They'll repeat it once, and then you answer the question. They can't repeat it more than once, so if you can't answer the question, they'll just continue to the next question. So generally people don't understand the questions in part one because it's something they're not expecting, or perhaps the examiner has interrupted them and interrupted with the question while they're still talking. So most times, hearing the question a second time is enough. If you still don't understand it, if you have no idea, then you probably can't answer it, which is not a big problem unless it happens a lot. Or if you think you have a rough idea of what the question is, just try to answer it and give a short answer and wait for the next question. So interrupting is another thing. If you notice the examiner is interrupting you a lot, that generally means your answers are quite long. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. So if there's no penalty for the examiner interrupting you, but it can be distracting, right? So what they will do is you'll still be talking and they'll just interrupt and break in with the next question. So that can be a bit jarring for some people, or also like you're still talking while they're asking the question, so you might not hear the question clearly and need to ask them to repeat it. Again, like the main issue with giving answers that's too long is not being stopped by the examiner. It's the fact that you're kind of speaking in circles, and often when you do that, you repeat yourself. And so if you naturally give long answers that are, good answers, they have a nice shape, beginning, middle, and end, and the examiner interrupts you occasionally, don't worry about it. But if it's happening a lot and you feel like you're just, because sometimes people get quite worked up and they're nervous and they just talk and talk and talk and talk. If that happens, let that be a sign to you that try to just regroup, relax, and try to give more concise answers. So shorter, more direct answers to the question. That doesn't mean short, but if you're just kind of rambling, that can create problems if you do that throughout the test. Now, most likely you'll understand all of the questions because they're quite simple, but if you don't understand a particular word, so if the examiner says, are you often on time for appointments? Something like that. Let's say you don't know the word appointment. You can ask what a particular word means. So you can say, what is appointments? And they'll say, an appointment is a time when people agree to meet, something like that. So, you can ask a quick question about a word and they'll give you a very simple definition. It probably won't happen much, but if it does, that's possible. So that's really all the questioning and asking you can do in part one. And later in other parts of the test, it's a bit more flexible, especially in part three. But for part one, one of the reasons it's meant to be easy is, to have a variety of different questions and topics, but also to allow the person to kind of relax and settle into the exam. Now, you won't feel relaxed, but just try your best to go with the flow, not think too much about it, listen, answer the questions, and then prepare yourself for what's coming next, because the later parts of the exam are more difficult. And if you can warm up a bit in part one, you'll have a much better chance of doing well in the later parts of the exam, which have a much greater effect on your score than the first part does. In fact, even high-scoring candidates, it's not uncommon for them to start out doing this well and to get better as the exam goes on. So, people feel a bit nervous. They might stumble a bit while they're speaking because of this in the beginning of the exam. But as the exam goes on, if their language skills are good, they get better and better and better and better. Whereas the opposite is also true, where it's quite typical for someone who's band 6, especially if they're not nervous or they've practiced and they're ready for the questions, to do really well in the beginning because the questions are quite easy, and then kind of worse as the exam goes on and the questions get more and more difficult. So that's sort of typical of Band 5 or Band 6. And that's also kind of why it's good if you can, respond really well to all the questions in all parts of the test, even Part 1, but it's not something that is as important as long as you're doing well in Part 2 and Part 3. Again, you don't want to have a disastrous Part 1, but there is some flexibility. So I was once examining someone, and there are always some strange topics that they're bizarre. Like you think nobody would ever talk about this outside of the IELTS exam. So there was a topic on trees. And so I asked the woman, do you work, are you a student, whatever the first topic was. And the second one was on trees. Do you like trees? And from the first part of the test, I could tell her English was quite good. And she just, what? And I said, do you like trees? And she said, huh? And okay, I've repeated the question. I can't say it again. Are there many trees where you live? What? And there was a big tree outside the window. And I was like, tree. And are there many trees where you live? What? Okay. Have you ever planted a tree? What? Have you ever planted a tree? What? And she just looked shocked, and she couldn't answer a single one of the questions about trees. We went on to Part 2. She did really well. Part 3, she did really well. She was very clearly Band 7. And so she ended up getting Band 7. There's no reason to penalize someone for that little part where she obviously was just confused. In fact, I did something that you're not supposed to do as an examiner. When the exam ended, before she left the room, I stopped the recording and I said, what happened in that part? And she said, why were you asking me about trees? And I said, well, that's one of the questions on the exam paper. And she said, it's very, very strange. You shouldn't ask people strange questions like that. And okay, so in that particular case, it didn't really affect her at all. If she had been more borderline 6 and 7, it's possible it might have lowered her score. But I mean, that's really quite an extreme response of not being able to answer a single question on a topic just because you're confused by the topic. So, there is some flexibility. One of the reasons you should try to relax and just sort of get your bearings is because there is more flexibility in what the examiners will allow. Again, if you use that part of the test to warm up and do better and better and better as the exam goes on, it shouldn't be a problem. So as far as, what type of answers you should give, again, I always talk about this magic 4-part way to answer any IELTS question. Listen carefully to the question, think about what you want to say it, and stop talking. Now that will produce a variety of answers with a variety of lengths, some shorter, some longer, some very long, some in the middle. That's expected. And so you really shouldn't try to give a long answer for every question. So a good basic answer will have what your answer is and why, and possibly a bit more detail if you can think of it easily. So for this question, do you like trees? If I said something like, no, I hate trees. Really, I really don't like trees. Or, yeah, trees are great. Trees are fantastic. Who doesn't like trees? Those answers are not really good because they're very short, but they also don't tell you much about why. So a better answer would be, do you like trees? No, I really don't like trees. I've got really serious allergies. And always in the spring, I'm allergic to this one particular type of tree, so I'm always very wary when there's lots of trees around because I don't want to have an allergy attack. Much better. I've explained everything. If I wanted to add a little bit more detail, of course I like the way trees look. They're beautiful. They purify the air. They're a part of nature. That's all very nice, but I just don't like them because of my allergy. So again, I've added a little more. That's not necessary. Sometimes it'll be easy. Sometimes it won't. Do you like trees? Yeah, trees are great. I live in the countryside and there are lots of trees where I live. There are lots of different kinds of trees. And so the countryside is very beautiful because of this. And I spend a lot of time in nature and I really enjoy being around trees. It makes me feel peaceful. Something like that. So that's it's not a very long answer, but it's fine. So remember, you're going to be asked, 10, 11, 12 questions during this part of the test. So if all of your answers are very long, they're not going to fit into the test. And if they're all very short, of course, the examiner is going to keep prompting you by saying why, why, why. So if the examiner is asking you why after every question, that's a sign that your answers are very short. But if you can follow this kind of give your answer and explain why. Give a little bit more information if it seems easy, then you'll generally give answers that are an acceptable length over the course of part one of the test. And you'll also give answers which are, they satisfy the question. One last thing to think about is practicing for part one. So it's a really good idea to practice with lots of part one questions, just so you have a chance to get used to the types of answers you're going to give. You have a chance to get used to, what's happening in your mind as you're answering. You're thinking ahead, you're talking and thinking about where you want to end your answer. That's a good practice to get into. And the more you do it, the better you'll be at answering questions in the test. However, if you look online, you'll find lots of questions for part one, and they're all reasonably accurate because questions for part one are just kind of personal questions about your likes, dislikes, preferences, your ideas about your experiences, things like that. However, the questions change 3 times a year. So I believe it's January, May, and September, new questions come out. And I don't know how they do this, but you can generally, if you look hard enough, you can find lists of the exact questions that are on the exam now. So right now, when I'm making this video, it's August, I can find, if I want, places on the internet where the questions are listed that are happening right now. And I've verified this with students. I've asked them about the questions that they got in the test, and they're on those lists. So generally when students hear this, they get really happy because they're like, okay, great, I'll know all the questions and I can prepare for them. However, that's a really bad idea. So it doesn't mean you shouldn't look at them. In fact, it's kind of a good idea to look at them, maybe think about what you would say for each one, especially any that you find a little bit strange, like, do you like trees? Then you'll be ready. But I wouldn't practice them, because even if you don't memorize your answers, sometimes people will prepare answers and try to memorize what they think is a good answer for every single question, it's a horrible idea. It's a disaster. You'll never get above N6 if you do this. But even if you practice answering the questions a lot, what will happen is the problem for memorization comes when you're speaking, you're not spontaneously creating the answer and speaking, which means that you're speaking from memory. So you're thinking back and trying to remember what the answer is, what you should be saying now. And in doing that, you take all of the focus away from speaking. And what happens is people that do this, invariably, every single time, you hear pausing because they are thinking about, okay, what's next? You hear repeat themselves because they forget something and then they go back to the beginning of the sentence and start it again. You hear self-correction, and also intonation when you're speaking from memory becomes very, very flat, and it's very easy to identify this. It's so easy that often when I'm giving a student a mock test, I will ask them about a question. So the question I asked you about trees, have you memorized an answer for that? No. Have you seen that question before? Yeah. Did you answer it recently? Yeah, I was practicing yesterday and I answered it. When you were answering the question, were you thinking back to your answer yesterday? Yes. Now, that's what I mean. There's no problem with, it's not like cheating. It doesn't mean that the examiner's like, oh, this person has prepared their answers. It's just that the consequence of even thinking about previous answers that you've given is a negative effect on intonation and fluency. And especially for part one, where the questions are easy, there's really no reason to try to memorize and think about your answers much. Like I said, if you want to look at the questions and just check and see if there are any difficult ones, and then think about what you would say, but not practice them, and then practice other questions. That's generally a much better approach rather than memorizing, I've never seen someone get a high score who memorizes answers or who practices the exact questions they're going to be asked a lot. So it's really something that you need to avoid. So for part one, try to relax, practice answering lots of questions, and don't worry too much about what the content of your answers is or making small mistakes from time to time. If you do that, you'll generally do well in that part of the speaking test.